Welcome to Part 4, the fourth module in our series on student growth. This module covers Part 2 of the Student Growth Plan, which is the baseline data and student growth goal target area. Baseline data is relatively easy to consider and describe. Here are some examples of questions that can help guide your thoughts when reporting information regarding your baseline data after the pre-assessment has been given. Here is a sample of an educator's baseline data. He or she discussed the measure that was used and the pre-assessment results for students in the population. Now let's take the next step on the plan by talking about what we have in terms of baseline data and turning it into a student growth goal. Here are some guiding questions to ask yourself when determining the growth goal for your population. It's important to look at evidence like trends, other assessment data, etc., to determine what would be reasonably attainable. This will be used to build a sound rationale for your target. Student growth goals should be informed by baseline or, in some cases, trend data. They should include specific indicators of growth that demonstrate an increase in learning between 2 points in time. This would be the pre to the post assessment. They should be tiered whenever possible and appropriate. This will allow for variances in growth depending on the needs of the student. Student growth goals should also have sufficient stretch so that all students can demonstrate developmentally appropriate growth. When thinking about student growth goals, all students must be expected to demonstrate growth, so attainment is not enough. The expectations captured in your growth targets should be rigorous, yet attainable, and growth targets should articulate a specific minimum expected performance. Don't be confused by attainment goals, where students demonstrate some level of proficiency. With an attainment goal, a student may show no growth or even negative growth. For example, a student can begin the year attaining an 80% proficiency goal by scoring 92% on the Algebra 2 pretest, and then continue to be proficient but not show growth by either maintaining the 92% on the post-test, or they can even have a negative growth by having an 87% on the post-test. Conversely, a student could start at 50% proficiency on the Algebra 2 pretest, score 75% on the post-test, but no growth would be demonstrating using an attainment goal. There are many different types of growth targets. The following is a video from the Missouri Department of Education that describes pros and cons to different types of growth targets. No type is endorsed specifically, as it is up to the educator to determine what is appropriate with sound rationale. Please also note that assessment development will continue to be a focus for the Valley View School District.
So there are at least 5 types of growth targets that we'll be discussing this morning. So the first and most basic is the basic growth targets. We'll also talk about half the distance growth targets, tiered growth targets, advanced tiered growth targets, and fully individualized growth targets. So basic growth targets. All students will grow by a set amount. So this is a very simple kind of growth target. For example, all students will score 20 points higher on the post-assessment as compared to their pre-assessment scores. So if a student scores a 70 out of 100 points, the expectation is that the student scores 90 points by the end of the interval of instruction. Likewise, a student who scores a 50 expected to grow to a 70. So these types of growth targets are easy to develop. They're also actually a very good choice for populations that are uniform. Now this isn't necessarily a common situation for a teacher to have students that are all about the same in terms of their level of preparation. for the material that would be covered in the course. But when that does occur, setting just a very simple growth target for your students can make a lot of sense. Now, one of the cons to doing that, of course, is that the level of analysis is quite low. And in situations where you have students that come into the course at various levels of preparation, unfortunately, these types of growth targets rarely ensure that appropriate rigor is present for all students. You can imagine, some students at the lower end of the achievement scale may need to grow quite a bit in order to be reasonably well prepared for the next grade level or for the next elective in a series of electives. For example, an example of that would be Spanish 1, a student who doesn't really grasp the content at the end of the school year or at the end of the semester may not be adequately prepared for Spanish 2. Okay, half the distance growth targets. Half the distance growth targets are a formula-driven method for setting targets. And the name comes from the fact that the targets are half the distance from the pretest to the highest possible score on the post-test. So again, and this is just for the sake of convenience, not every assessment you use will be out of 100 points. Let's say Susie scores 40 out of 100 possible points. So her target is a 70 because the 70 is halfway between a 40 and 100. You can do a little bit of math to verify that. So 100 minus 40 is 60. Half of 60 is 30. Add 30 to her baseline score of 40, and voila, you have a 70. So that's how that works. And these types of targets are very easy to develop. So once you get the hang of the formula method, they ensure rigorous targets for low-performing students. And one of the plus sides is that the formula approach makes targets comparable across teachers. If teachers are using a formula-driven process across the board, you can be assured that the same methodology is being used. There isn't any more rigorous target for one teacher or any less rigorous set of targets for another teacher. Now, of course, there are some cons. You ignore individual student data when you do this. In fact, you could completely ignore baseline data, choose this method, and end up with a set of growth targets at the end of the day. So that's typically not a very strong approach. It doesn't consider what 1 year of growth looks like for all students. So the half the distance method may predict 1 year's worth of growth, or however much growth is expected over the interval of instruction. It could be a semester, etc. But it doesn't consider that. So the chances that you'll predict that accurately based on this formula, it's possible, but the chances could be pretty slim. There's also no room for high-performing students to grow. If I score a 95 and the highest possible score is 100, don't have very much room at all to grow. I would be expected to hit a 97.5. So that's, depending on the assessment, that could be not much growth at all. Okay, tiered growth targets. In tiered growth targets, students are organized into tiers. Students in the same tier have the same target. So if you administer a baseline assessment, you might look at what the logical cut points are for classifying your students. You could look at the questions and decide what those questions reflect in terms of what students know and can do. And you could say, okay, based on these questions and based on how my students are scoring, it looks like those who scored a 0 through a 40 just really didn't grasp the content. So you might decide that that is one of your tiers. And then as you continue to analyze the data, you might say, okay, well, those who scored from 41 to a 55, they had some grasp of the content, but they're really still not quite there. So you'd continue working through your data in that way uh, to identify your tiers. And you can set your targets for each tier however you like. In this example, a student who scores between a 0 and a 40 on the pre-assessment would be expected to score a 60 on the post-assessment. And that's a range of scores. So I could score a 40 on the pre-assessment and my target is still a 60. One of the pros of this kind of method is the high level of analysis. I keep harping on this. A high level of analysis doesn't just mean because you're spending more time on it that it's going to result in a deeper understanding of your students. I'm not saying that spending more time analyzing your data translates into better information. But it can be the case that digging into that data helps you really understand what your students need. And tiers can be used to differentiate instruction. So you might have different sorts of strategies that you might implement with one tier as compared to the other. What's also cool about this kind of approach, targets can be adjusted by comparing performance of last year's students that are in the same tiers. Let's say, I'll just keep picking on this 0 to 40 baseline tier. Let's say that this is your second year using the assessment and your second year of using these same tiers. You could say, well, actually, I think I did a really great job teaching, and even still, most of my students didn't reach that target of 60 points on the post-assessment. So maybe that's good information that you could use to set a slightly lower target. Maybe 50 is a more reasonable target in that case. So that's an advantage. Now, one thing I want you to notice, and this is a fairly serious con, students just above or just below the cut points between tiers can have very different targets. And I'll just take as an example the bottom two tiers. So the 0 to 40 tier and the 41 through 55 tier. Let's pretend we're looking at two students, one of them who scores 40 points and another who scores 41 points. Well, notice how 1 point separates those two tiers. So that student who scores 40 points is expected to grow to 60 points on the post-assessment. Now that student who scores just 1 point better is expected to grow to a 70. So just 1 point difference on the pre-assessment translates to a 10-point difference on the post-assessment target. In some cases, that may not be appropriate. Another con, and this may not really be a con so much as a consideration, you may need to think about stretch. So stretch may be needed for your high-performing students so that they can demonstrate growth. So I just mentioned how students at the end of two consecutive tiers, can have very different targets despite similar performance. Advanced tiered growth targets are the solution to that. Now, bear with me. This could get a little bit more complicated, but the way this works, and I'll just sort of carry on from the previous example, is you have two possible scores that you could choose for any given student. What you would do, look at the baseline assessment score and then decide which target is higher. A constant target that you set that you think is reasonable in general for students in a given tier, or a variable target, which is just whatever the student scored on the baseline assessment plus a number that you decide is reasonable. So let's look at that student who scores a 40 and that student who scores a 41, just as an example. Which is the higher target for that student who scores a 40? Well, 60, that looks like a good target. But if I look at the variable target column, I would add 30 to the 40, so the target of 70 ends up being a higher target than the alternative of 60. So that's the target I'd go with for that student. I'd choose the 70. Now notice how this resolves the issue that we talked about before. Now I'm going to look at that student who scores a 41. My options are to set a target of 70, and that's in the constant column, or to set a target of 70 plus 25, and that's in the variable column. So 41 plus 25 is 66, and since that's lower than the constant target of 70, you would actually end up choosing a target of 70 for that student. So does that make sense? So notice how that student at a 40 ends up with a target of 70, and the student at a 41 ends up with a target of 70. So it's a much more reasonable target setting process in some situations, even though it's a little bit more complex. The last type of growth target methodology I'll discuss today is the fully individualized growth target. In this method, all students may have unique targets that are tailored to their specific needs. Now, for each student, analyzing relevant baseline data and trend data is very key in determining individual growth trajectories. When you have rich data on a small set of students, particularly, let's say, IEP students, where you have a lot of data that's been collected potentially from a young age, you can pull in lots of great data sources that may be available. You could pull in information from the IEP and get a very, very good sense of where you think that student is going. And so you could have a very precise growth target for that student. So special education teachers may have good luck with this type of methodology. Similarly, teachers of gifted students might have good luck with this particular approach as well. It works best usually if you have a small number of students in your SLO, just because there's so much analysis and so much thinking that has to go into deciding what's appropriate for each individual student. So obviously there's a high level of analysis involved, and as I mentioned, gifted classrooms including gifted students or students with disabilities, teachers of those classrooms may find that this is a flexible approach that really resonates with them. So yes, it can be a lot of work, and in future years it can be difficult to refer back to your rationales for similarly prepared students, just because the very specific information that you used probably won't be available for every student. One of the biggest disadvantages, this method is not very comparable across teachers. There's a lot of subjectivity and a lot of individual thinking that goes into it. Some good rules of thumb just in general when thinking about growth targets. Think about, what does a semester's worth of growth look like, or a year's worth of growth? Whatever that interval of instruction that you choose for the SLO, think about how much growth would you expect over that period of time. In some ways, it's a philosophical question. What makes sense for my students? How much growth would a year look like? How much growth, does 1 year represent? But you can look at data, you can look at trends and patterns over time to sort of make that connection a little bit more clear. Recognize how different levels of preparedness and individual characteristics impact growth. So I mentioned actually just a second ago the importance of looking for patterns. So you might find that students who are high performing or students who are low performing have specific characteristics in common and certain profiles of learning that make it easier to anticipate how much growth is reasonable for those types of students. You'll want good baseline and trend data. Unfortunately, there are some schools out there where data doesn't always flow down to the teacher, but it really is very important to have good baseline and trend data. So if you have a good relationship with your leadership, demand this kind of information in a polite way, but you do want to have the best data that you can. Consider whether expected growth is enough when the student is far below grade level. So I mentioned looking at expectations as sort of a guideline when determining your growth targets. The one real exception to that is when the student is far below grade level, because it can be, in some cases, a real disservice to the student, if the student goes on to the next grade level and just really isn't prepared. Incorporate stretch goals for high achieving students. So think about how you can really challenge those students. You don't just want to give them a target that you know that they can meet. You'll really want to challenge them and think about how can you pull in various kinds of projects, independent study projects or portfolio projects or things of that nature to really allow them to demonstrate what they know and can do.
Now that you have seen different types of growth targets, take a look at this example provided by the AFT. Here, the educator has set the following target for his or her students, saying students scoring 80 or lower on the pre-assessment will increase their scores on the similar post-assessment by at least 10 points. Any students scoring 81 or higher on the pre-assessment will maintain their scores. How could this growth target be improved? This target could be stronger. It does not sufficiently aim to bring students up to the proficiency standard, and not all students are required to show growth, and that is one thing that we need to ensure, is that all students are demonstrating growth, even our higher level achieving students. So some revisions that you can consider would be revise targets if students are very low performing, so that all low performing students are moving towards proficiency, and revise targets for students scoring 81 or higher so that they must demonstrate growth. Be mindful when you are setting student growth goals about the scoring method that you're using, because those impact the targets that you design. So be looking and determining whether or not you have a numeric rubric, a qualitative rubric, a skill advancement system, or whether you're using total points on an assessment. All of those will impact the student growth goal that you set. And remember, when you're determining your growth target, be thinking about how far you expect students to progress. Be thinking about where your students are at the beginning of the SLO interval of instruction and where your students need to be at the end of the SLO interval instruction. To wrap up, there are many different ways to set growth goals. Baseline evidence should inform the growth goals so that they are rigorous and appropriate, yet achievable. Growth goals must be related to the scoring method of the assessment on which they are based. And differentiating growth goals is a good way to meet students where they are and ensure that the goals are attainable. This concludes Module 4 of the AFT presentation on Type 3 SLOs. Our next module, Module 5, will be determining a student growth rating after data has been collected on the post-assessment and preparing for the summative conference.